Krivax let out a groan of appreciation as he took a delicious bite out of a handful of beetles well marinated with cloudberries. Although he still had a lot of work to do if he wanted to make some headway on his current plans, it was a relief to finally have access again to his favorite foods. It would make the Illidan-shaped political nightmare he'd eventually have to deal with so much easier to tolerate. "I have to admit, it's really nice to be back in Azrael Nerub after so long," said Krivax as he sorted through the various reports of what he'd missed after leaving for Kalimdor with his 4 arms. His quills were busy filling in a variety of permission forms that needed his approval. The Tauren were accommodating and the rations were good, but nothing beats a handful of web-spun obsidian beetles. "It is little surprise that the surface races lack access to proper foods," said Elder Nadox, as he dismissively sent away a skitterer who'd carried the delicacies to Krivax's office. "And I'm glad that you've returned from those wild lands as well. Vizier Hudrek is an adequate ambassador, but the Council has noticed a distinct increase in diplomatic complaints since your departure." Shortly after Krivax presented his proposal to Illidan and received a very tentative agreement that he would be interested in working together, Krivax had returned to Azrael Nerub to resume his diplomatic duties. The campaign against the Primals was still ongoing, but there was honestly nothing requiring him to remain on Kalimdor. The Primals couldn't be negotiated with, the Tauren were not particularly important from the perspective of Azrael Nerub, the Kaldoi were diplomatically intractable, and the Highborn were in the process of migrating to the Eastern Kingdoms. If he was needed back on Kalimdor, he could use the portal network at a moment's notice and be back to address any issue. Such was the convenience of magical transportation. Currently, Krivax was working in a personal office which had been assigned to him by the Circle of Viziers in Kilakuk, along with a half-dozen initiates ready to carry out any orders he could imagine. It was one of the largest and most well-furnished rooms in the city's ziggurat, showing the esteemed position he had in Kilakuk. The spacious office was actually directly above the room Vizier Hadix had trained him in when Krivax had first joined the Circle, which was definitely a strange twist of fate for him to think about. Over the past few years, Krivax's position in Nerubian society had definitely risen faster than he could have ever predicted. Krivax had already spent the past few days getting everything in order when Elder Nadox suddenly decided to come pay him a visit. It was a bit of a surprise since the High King's right hand rarely left the capital city, but he'd apparently already been in Kilakuk for some other matter. "I'm sure Vizier Hudrek did the best he could. I've just formed a personal connection with a lot of the emissaries, so it's easier for me," Krivax replied, feeling the urge to defend his subordinate. It's easy to become overwhelmed, especially when there are so many different issues at play lately. Krivax glanced through a particular report which detailed a diplomatic dispute that Azrael Nerub was having with cultivators over ship-grade timber. Apparently, there were some factions within the Maritime Kingdom who were growing worried that Azrael Nerub was about to threaten their monopoly by expanding lumber harvesting operations in the Howling Fjord. Elder Nadox clacked his mandibles together and let a chittering hiss filled with annoyance. "Indeed. The surface is far too chaotic a place, especially in recent times. Would that we could afford to ignore them without risking the safety of our people." Krivax didn't exactly disagree with the thought of hunkering down and taking a break once in a while, but he'd long since accepted that Azeroth would never be a place that could be considered calm. "As you say, Elder Nadox. I'm hopeful that the proposal I presented to the High King can help alleviate the worst of those potential threats in the future," said Krivax, hoping that Elder Nadox might be willing to share some news of how the Council was feeling about his idea. If the Alliance had access to a force of powerful individuals that could have been prepared the moment our seers sensed the primals and deployed as soon as we found them, our situation would be much less perilous. Predictably, Azrael Nerub was not at all happy with the current state of affairs regarding the primals. It was them more than any other member of the Alliance who was aiding in their containment, with only Dalaran and Quel'Thalas offering any meaningful assistance. Isolationist sentiments had been growing in Azrael Nerub from the very moment that Krivax had discovered the Eastern Kingdoms, suppressed only by the High King's pragmatic approach to foreign policy. Nerubians were an extremely communal people, so they were generally willing to fall in line with whatever the High King thought was best, but that only went so far. Now that the Order of Kalchut was no longer around to suppress those isolationist voices, it was primarily Nerubian lives and gold being spent to contain a threat on an entirely different continent. Discontent was growing among the various castes to a concerning level. If the Dreadlords managed to create a few more threats like the Primals, Krivax was worried that Azul-Nerub would decide to withdraw its borders and return to its insular ways. It was a mistake to stay on Kalimdor for so long, Krivax privately chastised himself, not for the first time. I should have been paying far more attention to what was happening in the rest of the world and actually doing something to push things in the right direction. You are not wrong that such a group may be useful, Vizier Krivax. But the Council finds itself reluctant to fund your idea, only to leave it under the discretion of the Alliance, said Elder Nadox, scoffing disdainfully as he referenced the Coalition. An organization whose name directly contradicts its nature. Hardly an alliance when we are bearing most of its burdens. Our people would have been better served had we waited for the arrogant Kaldoi to beg for assistance before offering it. Krivax hid a wince at the Elder's derisive words. If that was the growing sentiment of the other members of the Council, then things might be worse than he'd expected. Unfortunately, forming this group under the Alliance is a political necessity. There's no reasonable way to convince certain individuals to join otherwise, Krivax explained, hoping he could persuade the Elder. Realistically speaking, no influential faction would allow their most powerful individuals to go running off to join a paramilitary organization sponsored by a foreign nation. Having it under the Alliance was the only possible way to ensure that it had widespread appeal. That reminds me, I need to think of an actual name for it at some point. The Azerothian Sentinels. The Alliance Defense Force. The Adventurers Guild? I'll worry about it later. But even if the group is nominally under the Alliance's banner, it only makes sense for it to be led by a Nerubian, Krivax continued before his thoughts could get too far off track. After all, we'll almost certainly be its primary sponsor. Elder Nadox's expression lost some of its earlier derision, and Krivax could see a glint of interest in his multiple eyes. Do you truly believe that you can convince the surface races to agree to such an arrangement? They've shown themselves to be woefully incompetent when it comes to addressing future threats so far. I do. Especially given how things have been developing in the Eastern Kingdoms over the past few months, said Krivax, searching through the stack of scrolls on his desk for a particular report which had caught his attention earlier. I believe many of them would conclude that a supranational paramilitary force which answers to the Alliance would be beneficial to their interests. Things aren't exactly going well for them at the moment. Krivax handed over the scroll to Elder Nadox, allowing him to read through it and see the many difficulties that the Eastern Kingdoms were dealing with. The after-effects of the Second War were still making themselves known, even years later, and they weren't pretty. Getting them to agree to permit a force that could help solve many of their problems shouldn't be too hard. Although the devil would be in the details. Your arguments are not unconvincing, Elder Nadox said after a few moments of reading through the scroll. I believe that the High King would be willing to support your proposal, so long as you are truly able to convince the surface races of the need for such a force. Still, there are certain stipulations we would like to put forward. Krivax inclined his head in agreement. It was no surprise that Azul-Nerub would have specific requirements in exchange for fundings. He only hoped that none of these stipulations would be incompatible with the interests of the rest of the Alliance. He was going to have a hard enough time getting this off the ground without additional complications. First, the leader of this force must be a Nerubian, Elder Nadox said once Krivax gestured for him to continue. You mentioned this earlier, and we're in agreement. It is gratifying to see you vying for greater power, as most young viziers are prone to do. I was beginning to worry that you were devoid of ambition. I'm eager to see how you will manipulate the surface races into granting you this power. Such an attitude will benefit you well in your service to Azul-Nerub. Krivax nearly choked on his own surprise. Elder Nadox's tone was perfectly complimentary, but the actual content of his words were a tad bit concerning. Secondly, Elder Nadox continued as if he hadn't just casually complimented Krivax for being a power-hungry manipulator. Azrael Nerub will not provide a disproportionate amount of personnel for this organization. Isolationist sentiment has already grown to a point among the higher castes that we cannot afford to ignore it any longer. Allowing the surface races to exploit our generosity is something that can no longer be allowed to continue. That would make things harder for Krivax, but it wasn't a deal-breaker. Although, it was concerning that Elder Nadox had decided to explicitly acknowledge the growing discontent. The High King lived and died on their perceived power within Nerubian society, so any hint of political weakness could have long-term repercussions. Nerubians were a people who were extremely loyal to their leaders. Until they decided that you no longer served the common good, and then that loyalty very suddenly evaporated like water in the blazing sun. The balance of power was fragile, and even a perceived slight or moment of weakness could have dire consequences. Understood, Krivax replied, his mind already racing with political implications. I will ensure that our contributions remain proportionate to our commitment. Good, Elder Nadox continued, nodding in satisfaction as his many eyes bore in Krivax. Lastly, while we understand the need to ostensibly act under the banner of the Alliance, the interests of Azrael Nerub are always more important than those of the surface races. If there is ever a conflict of interest, we expect you to prioritize our kingdom over the demands of the Alliance. That was definitely the most challenging stipulation. Krivax had always done what he'd felt was best for Azeroth, because he knew for a fact that there were many things out there that would threaten the entire world. However, the aspects were probably the only other people who shared that perspective. If there truly came a moment when the interests of Azrael Nerub and the broader alliance were at odds, Krivax would find himself in a difficult situation. He would naturally choose to side with his home and kingdom, which allowed him to hold a position of power in the first place, but the diplomatic consequences could be catastrophic. I understand, Elder Nadox, said Krivax, bowing deferentially to the older Nerubian. I shall always seek to prioritize the interests of Azrael Nerub above all. Whatever personal feelings Krivax might have, there was little else he could say to his direct superior. If he had more time, then Krivax could have possibly found a way to ensure that the organization was more equitably funded amongst the Alliance, but that wasn't an option. Krivax wanted to get this up and running before Malygos opened a path to Pandaria and was ready to assault the Lich King, which meant time was of the essence. If Azrael Nerub was going to be its primary source of funding, then this stipulation would naturally be non-negotiable as far as the Council was concerned. Excellent. I'm glad to hear it, said Elder Nadox, sounding genuinely pleased. Your idea would be a useful tool to address emerging threats, such as the one reported recently by Vizier Hadix. Krivax felt a hint of concern well up within him. He'd tried to get into contact with Vizier Hadix just to catch up with his mentor, but hadn't been able to do so. What happened to Vizier Hadix? Asked Krivax. Oh, you hadn't heard? I'd have assumed he would have informed you of his injury, said Elder Nadox, his words causing Krivax's concern to grow as his mind wandered to the worst-case scenario. Vizier Hadix has recently been pursuing a growing void cult he believes to be connected to a particularly dangerous artifact. Unfortunately, his most recent attempt to confront this cult resulted in him suffering significant injuries. Krivax had already known that Hadix was pursuing rumors of Xalatoth, an incredibly powerful void weapon that he'd told the aspects about, and who in turn informed the Alliance. Anything involving Xalatoth was extremely dangerous, but he'd never thought that something bad might happen to Hadix. The only time he'd ever seen his mentor harmed was when he was trying to break into the house of an evil dragon with godlike powers. How badly is he injured? Krivax asked, voice betraying his anxiety. Elder Nadox paused, gaze sweeping over him assessingly. His physical wounds are well within the abilities of our queens to heal. However, his spiritual wounds are more severe. I'm told that he directly confronted the wielder of the weapon he's been pursuing and failed to capture them. He's currently stable and will make a full recovery, but it will be some time before he can safely return to his duties. Krivax quietly absorbed the information, his mind struggling to process it all. Vizier Hadix was someone who could go toe-to-toe with an empowered Chagall and survive, albeit with the help of an archmage. Xal'atath must be a profoundly powerful artifact if it allowed its wielder to overpower a mage of Hadix's caliber. I see. Thank you for informing me of this, Krivax said faintly, already deciding that he would go visit Hadix once this meeting was over. What happened to the Void Cult? Has someone taken over Vizier Hadix's position to hunt them down? Yes, but the cultists have fled to the Burning Steppes. Pursuing them is impossible without drawing the attention of Sorcerer Thane Tarissen, Elder Nadox explained, referring to the ruler of the Dark Iron Dwarves. Krivax hummed in thought as he considered the implications of what he'd just been told. The Dark Iron Dwarves were servants of Ragnaros the Firelord, who was generally considered to be aligned with the old gods. The Dark Iron clan controlled a rather large territory in the middle of the Eastern Kingdoms and were highly aggressive to outsiders, but they generally kept to themselves unless provoked. It wasn't a state of affairs that anyone was happy with, but Ragnaros was powerful enough that the aspects preferred to simply ignore elemental lords so long as he stayed within his territory. Krivax understood why they'd made such a decision given the vast array of responsibilities that the aspects were already burdened with, but he had a feeling that it was a decision they would one day come to regret. The Dark Iron clan's territory was the perfect place for all manner of void cultists to hide and gather their strength, including Deathwing's surviving children. All the more reason why I need to focus on my plans, Krivax mused to himself. If the Alliance truly establishes the Alliance Defense Force, or whatever they end up being called, I could freely send a task force to investigate these problems before they get out of hand. Thank you for sharing this information, said Krivax, bowing to the elder before deciding to move on from this topic. He could tell that Nadox was beginning to grow a bit impatient. Is there anything else that I can help you with, Elder Nadox? Unsurprisingly, there turned out to be a lot that he and Elder Nadox needed to discuss now that Krivax was focusing again on his regular duties. The Dreenii, who had by now properly settled on Northrend, were a significant change to the balance of power on the continent and needed to be carefully handled by Azrael Nerub. The council recognized that the Dreenii were abnormally kind and were too few in number to threaten the kingdom anytime soon, but Nerubians weren't the kind of people to trust in mere goodwill to protect them. The acquisition of Dreenii magic and technology, or an equivalent alternative, was a goal that the High King intended to prioritize. Krivax noted that the council also wanted greater access to the Janida as well as more information about the Naru. Vizier Hudrek's report did state that the Guardians of Nerub had good relations with the Dreenii and recommended that he should negotiate through them if possible. Another matter close to home was an initiative taken by one of his subordinates, Initiate Cruxax, to establish relations with the Taunker in Northrend. Apparently he found success by following similar, if modified, means that he used to first approach the Tuskar. Initiate Cruxax reports on the new form of shamanistic magic sounded promising and well suited for the Nerubian approach to magic. Krivax vaguely recalled how decay, the so-called sixth element, from the games were used by dark shamans, but not much beyond that. He just hoped it might be useful against the primals and other threats later. Elder Nadox found this a most pleasing development since it put the Taunker within Azrael Nerub's web of influence. It helped that the Taunker only asked for access to their Tauren brethren and to easily provided goods, all of which would barely be of any cost to Azrael Nerub as a whole. Elder Nadox also insisted that the two of them go over the list Krivax had given him earlier detailing the many troubles that the Eastern Kingdoms was facing. None of them had grown to the point of becoming a threat to Azrael Nerub, but the list was enough to reaffirm Krivax's conclusion that it had been a mistake to turn away to focus on Kalimdor for so long. Not only was the southern portion of the Eastern Kingdoms seeing an alarming increase in troll raids, but pirate activity had also grown to an unprecedented level. The Steamweedle cartel and the Blackwater Raiders had both recruited heavily from the horde remnants that littered the continent, giving them a large supply of battle-hardened warriors to bring into their ranks. Krivax suspected that the Dragonflight's swift capture of the Dark Portal meant that far fewer orcs managed to flee to Draenor than in the original timeline. Before the Second War, the pirates operating from Booty Bay had been heavily suppressed by the combined naval efforts of Stormwind and Kultiras. However, with Stormwind's navy effectively destroyed and the Kultiran navy heavily damaged, there was little to stop them from ravaging everything from the South Sea to Balor's coast. Krivax chuckled at Elder Nadox's suggestion to use this as an excuse to petition Stormwind for permission to create a new Nerubian port connected to the Nerubian enclave. If the concerning rumors of Vrakul's ships being sighted venturing beyond the shores of the Broken Isles turned into more than just rumors, then the coasts of the Eastern Kingdoms may soon become very dangerous. Krivax would prefer that the 10-feet-tall Vikings stay in Stormheim where they belonged, thank you very much. Aside from the trolls, pirates, and potential Vrakul, the nations of the Eastern Kingdoms were still dealing with a vast array of political consequences following the end of the Second War. The balance of power among the human nations had been significantly changed with the destruction of Stormwind and the heavy damage to Lordaeron's capital city, causing political friction as everyone got used to the new status quo. Ironforge and Nerubian were also both close to experiencing a technological renaissance due to their exposure to Uddaman, which, while good in many ways, had the potential to be destabilizing in its own right. Krivax had never really tried to push for technological revolution on Azeroth because he barely knew anything about how technology on Earth worked. Instead, he'd always believed that it would be more effective to simply expose minds far more brilliant than his own to new ideas. He had no doubt that the second Gnomish scholars were allowed to witness Titan technology within Uddaman. They had immediately begun trying to replicate them. However, the nation that had captured Krivax's attention the most was Quel'Thala's, as something truly unexpected seemed to be happening among the High Elves. Krivax wasn't exactly sure what facet of their internal politics was causing it, but Quel'Thala's seemed to have entered a stage of gradual rearmament. Reports indicated that the convocation of Silvermoon had approved a significant expansion of the kingdom's military. The number of fast riders currently being trained had nearly doubled, the Thalassian navy had commissioned several new vessels, and the Magisters had begun to emphasize the learning of war magics among their members. Not only that, but Quel'Thala's had started to become much more active in its foreign policy, making active efforts to spread its influence throughout the region. It was a startling departure from the aloof and arrogant stance they'd taken for the majority of their history. Krivax wasn't ashamed to admit that he'd somewhat looked down on Quel'Thala's. The High Elves acted as if they were above the mortal races, but were forced to hide from the Horde behind a magical shield while the rest of the Alliance fought for their lives. However, he could objectively admit that Quel'Thala's was a sleeping giant that could potentially become the dominant force in the Eastern Kingdoms if they ever got their act together. The elves seemingly being awoken from their arrogant complacency had the potential to vastly change the continent's geopolitical landscape. Given that Krivax didn't even know what initiated this change in attitude, he couldn't help but worry. Krivax and Elder Nadox continued to speak for several hours, discussing the many things that the Foreign Outreach Division would need to deal with. Krivax was unsurprised to find that Elder Nadox was brilliant when it came to politics, which was to be expected from someone who'd helped manage a continent-spanning empire for centuries. Nadox provided him with several strategies for the best ways to convince the rest of the Alliance to accept his proposals. Those strategies were a bit more manipulative than he would have liked, but Krivax appreciated it all the same. Eventually, Krivax decided that it would be a good idea to ask Nadox for any advice he might have on the whole Illidan situation. "You wish to recruit the aid of that demon-corrupted criminal who the Night Elves are so obsessed with?" asked Elder Nadox, his tone confused but not accusatory. "That seems like an endeavor far more troublesome than it's worth." Krivax couldn't exactly say that he wanted to recruit Illidan so that he could secretly summon a powerful dreadlord, so he chose an argument that the Elder would find more sympathetic. "I personally witnessed his power in Eldrathala's when he personally killed a few dozen demons by himself. After that moment, I immediately wished to use his power in service of Azrael Nerub," said Krivax, before leaning in toward Elder Nadox conspiratorially. "And I have to admit, it would be nice stealing one of the Kaldorai's greatest weapons." They weren't exactly the most pleasant of hosts while I was on Kalimdor. Elder Nadox let out a sinister chuckle as he responded. Ha! No need to say more. Undermining those arrogant, short-sighted elves is a pleasure that any vizier would find appealing. Although, it will be a difficult task for you to achieve. The hatred that Illidan garners in their society is truly beyond reason. Krivax nodded in agreement. Convincing the Night Elves to hand over control over their most hated prisoner would be no small feat. Do you have any advice to share with me, Elder Nadox? Krivax asked eagerly. The Kaldoi are far too arrogant to agree outright, regardless of anything you could offer them, said Elder Nadox, tilting his head thoughtfully as he considered the situation. The only way to succeed is if you convince the elves that this course of action was their own idea. I've heard reports that Illidan has become a divisive political issue within their society. Krivax had heard that as well. Maiev Shadowsong was not at all happy that her primary prisoner had been stolen from her grasp. There were arguments to be made that Taronda would be much better off if Illidan was somewhere far away from Kaldoi territory. Having him running around in front of a bunch of elves who'd lost family during the War of the Ancients was stoking the flames of resentment among her people. He and Elder Nadox traded ideas for a few more minutes before the older Nerubian announced that he had other matters to attend to. Krivax gratefully thanked the elder for his time and wisdom, feeling more prepared to handle the litany of tasks in his near future. Just as Elder Nadox was about to leave the office, he paused at the exit and turned back to face Krivax. There's just one more thing, Elder Nadox said slowly, his piercing gaze freezing Krivax on the spot. Has any of your former collaborators from the Order of Kalchut made contact within you over the past few months? Krivax felt a shiver run through his carapace at the elder's tone. Something told him that Nadox wasn't just making a casual inquiry, and that he had a good reason for asking. No, Elder, Krivax responded carefully, forcing his voice and his facial features to remain steady. I haven't heard anything from the Order since its dissolution, but I wasn't really a member long enough to form ties with anyone there. Why do you ask? Elder Nadox was silent as he studied Krivax, the air in the room growing heavy with tension. Finally, Nadox replied after what felt like an eternity. No reason. Have a good day, Vizier Krivax. Without another word, Elder Nadox exited the room, leaving Krivax wondering exactly what had just happened. Well, that was ominous. Krivax wasn't sure what that last exchange was, but it likely had something to do with some part of Azrael Nerub's internal politics that he didn't know about. However, something told Krivax that it was too important for him to just ignore it. Fortunately, I know just the person to help. Knowing what he had to do, Krivax began making his way out of his office and toward the portal hub so that he could go visit Vizier Hadix. Not only did he want to meet with his mentor to catch up with him and make sure he wasn't too injured, but Hadix knew far more about the Order of Kalchut and Azrael Nerub's politics than he did. It had been quite some time since he'd made contact with Hadix. It would be nice to finally change that. Within a wide-open cavern of the Nexus set aside for complex rituals, Malygos carefully studied the circle of Pandaren monks as they floated in meditative stances, green mists wafting off of them into the arcane glyphs below. A half-dozen of the most skilled mages in the Blue Dragonflight, all in their mortal guises, and Medivh, stood at intervals around the circle while channeling powerful arcane energies to support the ongoing ritual. Malygos constantly monitored the magical energies in the room, making minute adjustments every so often to ensure that the two separate types of magic did not clash. The aspect of magic couldn't help but frown as he realized that he needed to correct the flow of magic coming from Medivh far less often than he did the members of his own dragonflight. How mortifying that his own kin would lose to a mortal, however abnormal they might be. Creating a spell that could successfully make use of multiple different varieties of magic, arcane and spirit magic in this case, was not a simple endeavor. It had taken Malygos some time to learn the properties of the unfamiliar magic used by the Pandaren, but it eventually became clear to him that their magic would be essential in opening a path to Pandaria. The mists that sealed away the continent had thwarted all attempts that he had made to bypass them, almost seeming to react and adapt to any vulnerabilities he found. Eventually, a suggestion made by Krivax allowed Malygos to figure out exactly what was happening. Not only had the concealment magic been created by the mortal ruler known as Emperor Xiaohao, but they were also actively being maintained by him as well. Any time that Malygos attempted to breach the protective barrier, Emperor Xiaohao would sense it and adapt the mists accordingly, making full use of an entire continent's leyline network to do so. It was a magical game of cat and mouse that would never end. Realizing this had been utterly infuriating, and Northrend now had one less mountain than it did several months ago. Unfortunately, solving this issue was not as simple as Malygos would have hoped. While he had the assistance of Medivh, who had quite a bit of experience with spirits for obvious reasons, the same mists that protected Pandaria also prevented them from summoning Emperor Xiaohao and forcing him to end the spell. Malygos was nearly angry enough to destroy another mountain to relieve his frustration when he was suddenly informed that the Pandaren refugees from the Wandering Isle were attempting to make contact with him. Rather, to be more precise, they had traveled to Dalaran after Malygos teleported the mortals to the Eastern Kingdoms after talking to them on Zandala and forgetting about them. Once there they sought out the Council of Six, searching for anyone who could help them return to Pandaria and enact vengeance on the monsters who destroyed their home. Realizing that their assistance could actually be of use, Malygos soon found himself standing in front of a group of Pandaren monks, eyes filled with pain and a desperate need for vengeance as they offered him their assistance. Malygos would be lying if he said he hadn't been moved at all by the hatred in their eyes. He'd thought that he'd long grown numb to the suffering of mortals. But something about their raw pain stirred his memories in a way he had not thought about in a long time. Seeing no reason to turn them down, Malygos had brought them back to the Nexus so that they could assist him in his efforts. The Pandaren were not proper mages by any means, but the spell surrounding Pandaria didn't react nearly as virulently to them as it did him. While it wasn't enough for them to actually enter Pandaria, it was definitely enough for Malygos and Medivh to craft a spell that would allow them to contact Emperor Xiaohao. Hopefully, the troublesome spirit would have enough sense to allow them to access Pandaria and confront the Lich King. But given that Xiaohao had not already done so, it was likely that things would not be so simple. The spirit had been corrupted by the Shah of Pride according to Krivax, a void entity which fed off one's arrogance and hubris. Emperor Xiaohao was obviously not making decisions in a logical manner, or he would have already lowered the mists long ago. He wasn't quite sure that he was the one to convince an arrogant spirit to change their course of action and make the correct decision, but he would still try. Malygos was pulled from his thoughts as he heard a soft murmur to his side, one filled with a mixture of pain and silent hope. So close. So close until we can return to Pandaria. Master Shangzai, I swear upon the august celestials that I will avenge you. I swear it. Chen Stormstout was whispering to himself as he floated above the circle, most likely speaking out unconsciously as the spell neared its completion. Malygos didn't exactly need a reminder of what was at stake, but the mortal's words strengthened his resolve regardless. Eventually, Malygos sensed that the spell had successfully bypassed Pandaria's concealment magic and identified its target, completing the first portion of the ritual. The spell has found Xiaohao, Malygos bellowed, his voice echoing throughout the cavern. Prepare to draw the spirit in. Immediately, every mage participating in the ritual simultaneously changed the nature of the casting, acting in unison as they began pulling the spirit away from Pandaria. Xiaohao attempted to fight the summoning, but even a spirit with full access to his homeland's ley lines could not resist so many extraordinarily powerful mages. Soon, a blurry image began to solidify within the center of the circle, the ethereal form of Emperor Xiaohao, a Pandaren wearing white and gold robes, appeared while surrounded by wisps of energy and glaring at them in open defiance. Malygos huffed in disgust as he directed his senses at the spirit. If he hadn't known what he was searching for, Malygos could have easily missed the subtle corruption lingering on the spirit. But knowing what to expect, The foul stench of the old gods made Malygos wish that he could simply obliterate the spirit then and there. Unfortunately, Malygos rarely had the opportunity to indulge in his more violent impulses now that he somewhat cared about acting responsibly. The spirit has arrived. Activate the containment spells. Malygos ordered as soon as the spirit was sufficiently solidified. A complex geometric pattern of blue and emerald lines flared to life on the ground around Emperor Xiaohao, trapping the defiant spirit within. The circle shimmered and seemed to solidify, turning the interior into a translucent dome. Malygos meticulously examined the magic for several moments before nodding in satisfaction. The spell was more than enough to keep Xiaohao contained long enough for their conversation to take place. "Why have you summoned me?" "It is my duty to stand in eternal vigil over my lands. Every moment that you keep me here is another that I cannot help my people." Xiaohao's voice, regal and tinged with anger as he spoke in Pandarin, echoed in the cavernous room. "They need me now, more than ever." "Calm yourself, spirit. We have every intention of releasing you," Malygos lied, doing his best to not antagonize the volatile spirit as he responded in the spirit's own language. "If you look below you, you'll see that the spell containing you is set to expire within the hour. We merely wish to ensure that we have the opportunity to speak with you." Malygos had told the truth about the spell, but he obviously had no intentions of letting Xiaohao go free now that he'd finally captured the spirit. He would be getting into Pandaria, one way or another. Xiaohao studied the spell before looking around suspiciously, his gaze falling upon Pandaran monks floating in meditation. His expression briefly softened, and Malygos felt the corruption on the spirit weaken just a fraction. "While we do not know the exact details, we are aware that Pandaria is currently being attacked by a being which wishes to do nothing more than spread death across your lands," Malygos continued, speaking more diplomatically than he'd needed to in centuries. "The Wandering Isle was destroyed by this same being, and your people call for vengeance. Allow us access to Pandaria, and we will aid them in achieving this goal." A conflicted expression appeared on Xiaohao's face, and Malygos could sense the corruption flare up as the spirit fought to make the rational decision. The Shah of Pride did not seem to have total control over the spirit, its influence far more subtle than most void corruption. "Strange. You speak the truth. Undeath sweeps across my lands like a plague, destroying everything in its path and growing more powerful by the day," said Emperor Xiaohao, his voice trembling in sorrow and rage. "The Shah grow more powerful by the day, and it won't be long before they corrupt the land as well." For a moment, Malygos thought that the spirit might agree without further issue, but it didn't take long for pride and arrogance to grow in Xiaohao's eyes. "But why then would I turn to the outside world for assistance?" Xiaohao continued, glaring at Malygos. "It was you and your kind who destroyed this world during the Sundering and invited demons to our lands. I'm sure that the august Celestials will be fully capable of defending Pandaria without outside intervention." Malygos felt a twinge of annoyance at being blamed for the actions of power-hungry elves, but held his tongue. "Even if that were so, denying our assistance will cause more of your people to perish than is necessary. Is it not your sworn duty to protect them, spirit?" Emperor Xiaohao, his gaze still filled with arrogance, looked about to retort before he was suddenly interrupted by Chen Stormstout. The monk, no longer submerged in mediation now that the spell had been complete, stepped forward to address the spirit. "Emperor Xiaohao, please," Chen Stormstout's voice cracked with emotion. "Allow us and these outsiders to enter Pandaria. I watched personally as that monster destroyed my home and ruthlessly slaughtered our people. Not a single one of us will be able to rest until we stop the rest of our people from suffering a similar fate. Please, I beg of you." Xiaohao's eyes widened as the monk, and every other Pandaran in the room, fell to the floor and pleaded for him to help them. How have I become so blinded by pride?" Xiaohao whispered to himself quietly as his gaze swept through the room before turning to Malygos. When he next spoke, his voice was louder and filled with determination. "Stand up, children of Pandaria. You are right. The time for isolation is over, and the time to act is now. If these outsiders are willing to help, then I will let them." Chen Stormstout, tears of gratitude in his eyes, nodded as he got to his feet. "Thank you, Emperor. Thank you." It wasn't long before the room was filled with similar words of gratitude as the rest of the monks celebrated. Malygos ignored the excitement of the mortals as he focused on the corruption within the spirit. It had become dormant after the monks pleaded with the spirit, but he knew that the threat was far from eradicated. The void-corrupting Emperor Xiaohao had merely retreated for now, and would no doubt reassert itself at the worst possible moment. If it were possible for him to simply purify the spirit, then Malygos would have immediately done so the moment that the Xiaohao had arrived. Unfortunately, Emperor Xiaohao was intrinsically connected to Pandaria, so they would need to deal with the source of the corruption if they wished to purify the spirit. Malygos turned his gaze to the other side of the cavern and saw that Medivh wore a similarly grim expression as he observed the spirit, clearly recognizing the lurking danger. How troublesome. Still, Malygos allowed the sounds of jubilant mortals to wash over him as he enjoyed this moment of victory. Now that they had access to Pandaria, he would finally be able to thoroughly assess the situation and develop a plan to confront the Lich King. Malygos only hoped that his enemies hadn't already grown too powerful. "Why do you insist on forcing me to try all of these strange drinks made by the surface races?" asked Hadix, lounging in a meticulously woven bed of webs as he stared skeptically at several bottles of wine that Krivax had brought for his visit. "Come on, what's wrong with trying new things every once in a while?" Krivax asked encouragingly as he poured the wine into a glass and handed it to his mentor. "I don't see what the problem is. If I had lived for as long as you have, I would savor every new experience that came my way." It had been a while since he'd actually met with Hadix, and Krivax was surprised to find how much he'd missed the grouchy old Nerubian. There weren't many people who could look so disgruntled while being offered wine made by one of the most prestigious wineries in the Eastern Kingdoms. Prior to making contact with the surface races, the only Nerubians who had experienced the effects of alcohol were the Azrael Nerub's alchemists. After all, Nerubians generally weren't interested in mind-altering substances unless they could somehow be used to increase efficiency. However, that sort of cultural attitude really didn't sit well with the major breweries and wineries throughout the Eastern Kingdoms, many of which were surprisingly influential. Azrael Nerub had the potential to be a truly massive market that they could exploit if they managed to create a drink palatable to the average Nerubian. As a result, Krivax often found himself being sent free samples of various alcoholic drinks by merchants across the Eastern Kingdoms. Krivax enjoyed trying them in his free time, despite the drinks needing specific alchemical ingredients if he wanted to get drunk. Unfortunately, most of them were less than stellar. The Frost Lotus-infused wine, sent by the Fulrook estate from the Hillsprad foothills, used ingredients imported from Northrend and was by far the best he'd ever tried. His current objective was to find a wine that Hadix would like so he could get to see the normally severe vizier drunk. Given how many serious matters he had to deal with on a day-to-day basis, Krivax had every intention of finding some fun where he could. "Taking you on as an apprentice has given me all of the new experiences I need for 3 centuries, Hadix grumbled irritably as he twisted the wine glass to study it from every angle before finally taking a tentative sip. "Well, how is it?" Krivax asked eagerly, putting aside the documents he was reading and turning his full attention to the vizier. One of the best parts about having enchanted parchment and quills that could fly and hide information from anyone not authorized to read them was the ability to get work done wherever he wanted. Whether he was lounging in his chamber, walking through the caverns of Azrael Nerub, or visiting his injured mentor, Krivax could easily find an open space and start filling out documents. Given that he didn't need to sleep and that the work coming his way seemed limitless at times, no matter how much he tried to delegate, that ability was priceless. Although, looking back on it now, perhaps there was something else wrong if he needed to work all of the time. Hadix swirled the wine in his glass, pausing for a moment as he seemed to ponder over the best words to describe the experience. "It's unexpectedly pleasant," Hadix admitted, a touch of surprise and nostalgia in his voice. "The flavor is more subtle than those previous concoctions you had me try. It tastes like it was distilled with luminous dew, a plant which used to be harvested from the fungi farms deep within Azshol Nerub when I was younger. I haven't had anything like it in quite some time. Krivax could see just how much Hadix enjoyed the drink and suddenly felt a bit guilty that he just wanted to see what the vizier was like when he was drunk. Not guilty enough to stop, however. I'm glad to hear that, Krivax said enthusiastically as he placed a bottle of wine on a floating tray near his resting place. Feel free to enjoy as much of it as you want. After all, I doubt you'll have another chance like this to relax in the near future. He was confident that was the case, as Hadix was the only person he knew who was more of a workaholic than himself. Hadix grumbled under his breath, but didn't refute Krivax's words as he quietly poured himself another glass. Seeing this, Krivax turned his attention back to the documents floating about him, diligently continuing his work. Many of them were responses and requests to various Alliance officials in regard to his Alliance Defense Force proposal, so they were actually quite important. Krivax had wanted to call his organization the Adventurers Guild at first, but most kingdoms seem to have legal restrictions about what could and couldn't be called a guild, any of which contradicted each other. His proposed organization didn't qualify with many of them, so it was simply less of a pain to choose a different name. He also read through a report he'd requested from his subordinates about the Dreenii and Tauren's integration into the rest of Azeroth. The former was progressing fairly well, with trade between Azshol Nerub and the Dreenii increasing every day. Not only that, but connections between the Dreenii and the Church of the Holy Light were flourishing. Given that the Dreenii had a Naru with them, which was basically the Azerothian version of a literal angel, that was no surprise. However, the Tauren were simply less technologically advanced compared to other societies and thus had much less to offer. Still, it was nice to read that they were no longer under active threat by the Centaurs. The combination of the primal encroaching on Centaur land and a steady supply of weapons to Tauren by Azshol Nerub was enough to deter them. Are you really so free of time that you can afford to waste it so frivolously? Vizier Hadix asked gruffly from the meticulously woven web he was currently lounging in. There's truly no need for you to be here, brat. I don't see anything wrong with spending a little bit of time with my favorite vizier, especially when he's injured, Krivax said teasingly as he finished penning a letter to Anduin Lothar, current Regent Lord of Stormwind. Besides, I'm perfectly capable of doing what work I need to do here and keeping you company at the same time. Krivax was more than a little glad that Hadix had been told to avoid using magic as much as possible while recovering from his injuries. Otherwise, Krivax was sure that he would have had something telekinetically thrown at his head. Hadix was of course more than willing to express his displeasure in other ways, but he hadn't actually forbidden Krivax from visiting, for all his grouching. I hardly see the point. This is certainly not the first time that I've been injured, said Hadix, huffing and tapping another sip of his wine. Malygos had discreetly informed the Alliance that he'd secured a path into Pandaria. As a result, everyone in the know was doing what they could to prepare themselves to fight undead in the near future. Currently, he and Hadix were in the Dalaran's Nerubian enclave. Krivax felt like Hadix would be better served returning to Azshol Nerub for medical treatment, but the old vizier insisted on remaining in the Eastern Kingdoms. Apparently, this was a sensitive period of time in his efforts to root out the void cults, and he wanted to be available in case any of his colleagues or subordinates required his expertise. From everything that Krivax had seen, he was starting to get the feeling that Dalaran had just grown on Hadix. The vizier who he'd first met in Killercook would have never passed up the opportunity to avoid interacting with the surface races, but things had obviously changed after he started working with the Kirin Tor. Honestly, it was a surprise sometimes for him to go out into the streets of Dalaran and see just how nonchalant the locals had become about the giant spiders walking their streets. Seeing the results of his efforts might have even brought a tear to Krivax's eyes. If he had any tear ducts. Well, even if you don't appreciate my wonderful company, it's very helpful for me to have free access to your expertise, Krivax said placatingly, though his words were completely the truth. After all, those of us who haven't lived for centuries sometimes need help in order to accomplish their goals. Humph. It's gratifying to see that I've taught you well enough to at least know that, Hadix drawled, voice still surprisingly composed despite drinking several glasses of wine. Then tell me, how is that little project of yours progressing? Hadix was surprisingly approving of his plan to create a paramilitary force under the Alliance to address specific threats. Although, perhaps it shouldn't be that surprising given that the Vizier had spent centuries combating mind-bending monsters for a secret organization. Hadix was very much a believer in proactively destroying threats with extreme impunity before they could become a problem. It's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest, Krivax said hesitantly as he gave a brief sigh and read through a report on the growing piracy situation. Responses are positive for the most part, which was to be expected given that Azrael Nerub will be the ones funding the program. The nations of the Eastern Kingdoms have no reason to oppose it when it costs them nothing. The Kaldoi have shut down any proposals to join the alliance, and are extremely reluctant to accept even associate status, which was also to be expected. I'm working on it. Now was probably the best time for Krivax to convince the Kaldoi that they should work with the rest of Azeroth. While the primals were proving to be an unfortunate distraction and drain on resources, they also gave Krivax a bit of leverage when speaking with the Night Elves. After all, the primals were primarily a problem for Kalimdor. If Azrael Nerub were to withdraw military support from the efforts to contain the creatures, then the Kaldoi would not be in a good place to handle it. Of course, the aspects wouldn't approve of this and the primals would likely be able to spread if they overcame the Night Elves, but that didn't mean it wasn't still an effective threat. Although, it was a bit difficult wording a threat that was explicit enough to be understood and also subtle enough not to overly anger the Kaldoi. Elvish pride was a delicate thing, often pushing them into doing things that were counterproductive if they felt slighted. However, Krivax had decided that it would be best to push the Night Elves after the Alliance had already formed the organization, as that would give him much more leverage. None of that was unanticipated. So long as I continue as planned, the Alliance should agree to form the Alliance Defense Force and allow a Nerubian leader, Krivax continued as he shuffled through his notes, searching for a particular letter. At least, that's what should be happening. In reality, I'm receiving a surprising amount of excuses and complaints, most of which seem to be coming from factions affiliated with Quel'Thalas. Krivax handed over an unofficial letter he'd received from Count Dalton of the Alterac Kingdom. After King Perinolda made up an obvious excuse to delay his acceptance of the Alliance Defense Force, Krivax contacted one of his few acquaintances in the kingdom to learn more. Apparently, the only noble family in the kingdom who'd been allowed the privilege of trading with Quel'Thalas was pushing for the king to refuse his proposal. It had been clear for a while that the High Elves were beginning to actually take notice of events beyond their borders and make use of their influence, but this wasn't how he'd hoped things would develop. Oh, how surprising. I hadn't expected those foolish elves to actually do something competent, said Hadix, sounding impressed as he read the letter in one hand and poured himself another glass of wine with one of his others. Competent? All they're doing is making my life more difficult, Krivax replied, unable to keep the offense from his voice. The Alliance Defense Force will help Quel'Thalas just as much as everyone else, so why are they trying to stop it? I thought they'd already learned after the Second War that they can't afford to ignore the threats of the outside world. It was honestly baffling to Krivax that the High Elves were working against him when he was just trying to help everyone. The whole point of ensuring that the Horde didn't reform was so that Azeroth wouldn't have unnecessary political divisions while also dealing with existential threats, but it seemed like things weren't going to be that easy. However, the most frustrating thing about the whole situation was that he didn't really know the motivations behind it. Quel'Thalas had always been an insular and closed-off kingdom, allowing entrance to only a few merchants while their citizens rarely left their cities. Krivax knew quite a bit about the High Elves, but most of that was due to either meta-knowledge or the benefits of his position. For the average human walking the streets of Capital City, Quel'Thalas might as well be a mythical land from fairy tales. While this was slowly beginning to change, it meant that Elvish internal politics were utterly opaque to anyone living outside of the city. For all he knew, King Anasterion could have been overthrown in a coup, or Silvermoon could have secretly been taken over by a dreadlord. Prince Kael'thas hadn't returned to Dalaran in months and wasn't answering any letters, so there was no way for him to know. Krivax explained all of his frustrations to Hadix as the older vizier lounged in his web with a contemplative expression. After several moments, Krivax was more than a little surprised when Hadix let out a soft chuckle. "If I were to guess, I would assume that you've fallen victim to your own success," said Hadix, a hint of amusement coloring his voice. "If the elves have made such a dramatic departure from their normal behavior, then the most likely explanation is that they've begun to view Azrael Nerub as a genuine threat to their influence and safety, rightly so. That being the case, it's obvious that they would oppose you." Krivax hated to admit that Hadix's theory made sense, though it seemed woefully short-sighted to him. "But don't they understand that we have more important things to worry about than competing for political influence?" Krivax asked with exasperation, glaring at a document from Kultiras that was also awfully non-committal. He hadn't even known that Quel'Thalas had any dealings with the maritime nation. "They've been informed about the Lich King, just like everyone else. I thought that people were supposed to come together during times of crisis, not waste time with petty political nonsense." He'd seen how the Eastern Kingdoms had come together to deal with the Horde, and had expected something similar when it came to the Lich King. Much to his confusion, however, the sense of urgency among the various nations was far less than compared to the Horde. He could understand that the Lich King was much farther away, but the aspects had been explicitly clear about the severity of the threat. So why was Krivax still needing to deal with political infighting when they were all working toward the same goal? "Once again, you are a victim of your own success," Hadix explained, his expression more relaxed as ever as the alcohol began to take effect. "The surface races likely expect the Lich King to be handled by either us or the Aspects, and why wouldn't they? It doesn't help that no matter how threatening the dragons claim this necromancer to be, nobody has seen the proof with their own eyes. Until the undead begin to invade their own lands, a significant portion of them will always remain unconcerned." Unfortunately, that sounded distressingly plausible to Krivax. While the people of the Eastern Kingdoms held no great reverence for the Aspects, nobody could deny the power of the beings who put an end to the Second War in a single day. With such powerful figures on their side, why would the nations of the Eastern Kingdoms feel pressured by such a distant threat? "Well, that time may come sooner rather than later," Krivax grumbled as he thought back to the first reports he'd received of the situation in Pandaria. With nobody being able to locate the giant undead turtle fortress that's swimming around somewhere, the Lich King could appear on their shores one day without warning. Once he gained access to Pandaria, Malygos had immediately set about thoroughly scrying the continent to get a good idea of the situation. It hadn't taken the aspect of magic long to discover that the Scourge had established a fortified stronghold on the Isle of Thunder, the death magic radiating from that place apparently as obvious as a beacon in the dark. Unfortunately, the Dreadlords weren't incompetent enough to just conveniently leave Shenzhen Su parked off the coast of the island like an unattended car. If the Lich King was a stationary target, then the Aspects would likely have already developed an invasion plan and moved to wipe the Scourge off the map before they could grow any stronger. With the Lich King currently missing and doing who knows what, the Aspects were hesitant to reveal that they've gained access to Pandaria with an assault on a heavily fortified location that wouldn't destroy the main threat. Better to lure the enemy into a false sense of security and suddenly teleport 4 super dragons on top of them when they least expected it. At the very minimum, Malygos insisted that they knew the location of the Dreadlord around the Lich King before launching an assault. "Rather than just whining, you should actually do something about it," Hadix continued, his words only slightly slurred by the wine. "I taught you better than to simply complain about your problems. This Alliance defense force of yours is a good idea, and you've always been bafflingly competent at stumbling your way into getting what you want, so do it again." Krivax couldn't help but feel somewhat hearted by Hadix's gruff encouragement. There were only a handful of times over the years when the Vizier gave him a compliment. "You think I'm competent?" Krivax asked teasingly, mood rising at his mentor's disgruntled expression. "Perhaps you should drink more often." Haedix shot him a withering look, although Krivax could tell that the vizier was more amused than insulted. "Don't push your luck, brat. A prestigious political position and ridiculous dragon powers won't stop me from tossing you out of this chamber." "Fine, fine, I'll behave," said Krivax, chuckling as he raised his hands in surrender. "But you're right. If I want to deal with this issue, then I'll have to confront the root of the problem. I suppose a visit to Silvermoon City is in my near future." "Humph. Good idea. I'll go with you. We should probably learn what's caused those elves to start acting this way before they make a mess of things like usual," said Haedix, nodding approvingly before gesturing imperiously to a different bottle of wine that was also sent by the Fallbrook estate. "Now hand me that bottle. Let's see if their previous success was merely a fluke or something worthy of attention. I know several viziers who might appreciate a drink of such quality if so." Suddenly, Krivax had an image of several stern-faced viziers sitting around a web-laden room and pretentiously critiquing wine and couldn't help but laugh. Vizier Haedix immediately took in his surroundings the moment that he stepped through the portal to Silvermoon City. His proposal to join Krivax during his diplomatic visit to the elves had been born from a combination of boredom and mental inebriation, but it was no great burden. Until his moderately concerning hypersensitivity to the void disappeared, Haedix had little else to occupy his time with other than ensuring his fall apprentice didn't get himself killed. He hadn't genuinely considered that to be a serious concern before leaving for Silvermoon, but the sight in front of him didn't fill him with confidence that the day would be purely peaceful. There was a distinct air of tension surrounding the high elves waiting to greet them. It was a subtle thing, something that Haedix would have failed to notice if he had not spent months meticulously studying the body languages of the surface races. However, that tension, along with the several elves wearing crimson armor and carrying large two-sided blades, set him on edge. Haedix glanced toward his overly large apprentice and confirmed that Krivax had noticed the situation as well. The brat was often foolish on several matters, but his position as a diplomat had greatly improved his ability to both lie and discern the feelings of others. Haedix discreetly caught the attention of the leader of Krivax's protection detail and tapped 2 fingers from his lower hands against his leg. The gesture could be mistaken for a simple nervous tic, but Haedix knew his message had been understood when the guard captain subtly shifted his stance, putting himself in a better position to draw his weapon if necessary. Haedix briefly contemplated casting protection spells over himself, but decided against it when his gaze drifted toward the armored elves who he recognized as spellbreakers. Intelligence reports from the Circle of Viziers analysts had not been very clear about the extent of their abilities, but the spellbreakers were an elite group of elvish warriors capable of disrupting and contorting magical energies. It was no great stretch of logic to assume they were also skilled at detecting such magic. The closest equivalent Haedix was familiar with was Azrael Nerub's own obsidian destroyers, making them very formidable foes. The Circle of Viziers advised tearing the spellbreakers to pieces with swarms of skitterers, but Haedix currently didn't have such a swarm at hand. Unfortunate. "Hello. Thank you for agreeing to allow us into your beautiful city," said Krivax, his voice forcefully cheerful as he spoke in impressively fluent Thalassian. "I am Ambassador Krivax of Azrael Nerub. I believe I'm here to speak with King Anasterion." In front of the spellbreakers was an elvish woman with sharp, dark eyes and dressed in a flowing silver gown made from one of the most expensive varieties of silks exported by Azrael Nerub. It was heavily enchanted, and wouldn't be out of place on both a battlefield or at a royal ball. Although Haedix had educated himself on the body language of the surface races, he was unable to discern anything aside from polite professionalism from the woman's expression. "Greetings, Vizier Krivax. I am Delania Evermind, the magistrix assigned to welcome you to our city," said the woman, offering a graceful bow. "I'm afraid there must be some confusion. You are scheduled to meet with Grand Magister Belovia, leader of the Convocation of Silvermoon. Concerning. I see. I apologize for my ignorance, but has something happened to King Anasterion?" Krivax asked politely. It is sometimes difficult to hear news of events in Quel'Thalas from beyond its borders. Magistrix Evermind smiled, her expression revealing little. Matters such as these are best handled by the Convocation. King Anastarian need not be bothered. I assure you, Grand Magister Belovia is completely authorized to speak for our people. Haedix instantly understood from the content of the elf's words that the Convocation of Silvermoon had recently increased its influence over elvish society. Quel'Thalas was a nation with a rather strange type of government. Unlike other more sensible nations which empowered a single ruler to make decisions on behalf of their nation, the elves just had to be different. They employed a system which distributed power between the royal Sunstrider dynasty and the Convocation of Silvermoon, a council of the 7 most powerful lords in Quel'Thalas. From what Azjol Nerub was able to discern, the Sunstrider dynasty had been losing power to the Convocation for millennia, a process accelerated by Prince Sunstrider choosing to live in Dalaran rather than among his own people. Apparently, the Convocation had now gathered enough power that they were now the ones making foreign policy decisions in elvish society. Haedix found this development to be somewhat concerning. If the elves were now being led by an individual who was both competent and resentful of Nerubian influence in the Eastern Kingdom, as circumstantial evidence suggested, then it could be a problem. Krivax had always been far more concerned about grand existential threats like the Burning Legion and their schemes than mundane politics. Haedix had to admit that he felt similarly, the vast majority of his life dedicated to combating the malign influences of the old gods. However, he had been burned enough by political realities to understand that they couldn't be ignored. Very well, Magistrix Evermind, Krivax responded, maintaining his composure. We look forward to meeting with Grand Magister Belovia. I haven't spoken to him since our meeting in Capital City in the immediate aftermath of the Second War, so I look forward to it. Magistrix Evermind nodded and gestured to the guards, who immediately fell into a protective formation around them. Excellent. If you would please follow me, said Magistrix Evermind, leading them through the empty hallways of the portal facility and onto the streets of Silvermoon City. Haedix ignored the diplomatic fawning coming from his apprentice and focused intently on his surroundings. The very first thing that Haedix noticed was that the building they had just left must have been heavily warded, otherwise he would have immediately sensed the vast font of arcane magic in the far north. Silvermoon City was famous for not only being the capital of Quel'Thalas, but also because it drew directly from the most powerful source of arcane magic in the Eastern Kingdoms, the Sunwell. Sensing it now, Haedix could already determine that the Circle of Viziers had vastly underestimated the potency of the Sunwell, as it was many times stronger than the leyline nexuses under Dalaran or in Killer. It was easy for Haedix to see now how the elves had remained so prosperous despite the poor decisions of their leaders. The second thing that Haedix noticed was how thoroughly intertwined Silvermoon City was with magic. He could see several large golems patrolling the streets, their limbs and torso floating independently of each other with arcane crystals powering their movements. Light fixtures gently illuminated the streets while levitating in the air, seemingly for no reason other than aesthetics. Nearly every building was predominantly blue and gold in color and made from some manner of magic-infused material, allowing for powerful wards. The very air itself seemed to pulse with magic, leading Haedix to believe that his casting spells would be several times easier in Silvermoon City than elsewhere. As Magistrix Evermind led them toward Silvermoon's administrative district, Haedix noticed that none of the elvish civilians seemed to be suffering from hunger or sickness. Even when the other surface races attempted to hide the destitute portions of their societies, there was always something that escaped the web. Be it the gaunt face of a beggar, the persistent cough of a diseased peasant, or the distant cry of a hungry hatchling, Haedix had never seen a nation that could match Azjol Nerub in prosperity. Silvermoon seemed different. Not only that, but he could sense that every single civilian could potentially learn magic. This only heightened Haedix's unease as he began to worry that Quel'Thalas may actually have the ability to become a true competitor to Azjol Nerub. What they lacked in sheer numbers and resources could potentially be compensated for by the Sunwell and a powerful populace. Notably, however, the thread of tension that Haedix could see in the Spellbreakers was non-existent among the elvish civilians. If Quel'Thalas was indeed suffering from internal instability, then its people seemed ignorant of it. Eventually, the magistrix led them to a grand building larger than a Nerubian cigarette and surrounded by 7 towers reaching high into the sky. The structure had clearly been constructed with the intention of displaying power and influence, as it seemed to loom over the surrounding buildings and was rather grandiose in design. However, Haedix paid little attention to this and instead noted its many defenses, as that was what was truly important. Its large, ornate doors were guarded by 2 golems and several elite spellbreakers who were stationed at its entrance. Although he couldn't see them, Haedix could sense several elvish archers camouflaged in strategic positions on the towers. He could even sense someone flying through the air under the cover of an invisibility enchantment, most likely a dragonhawk rider. Haedix couldn't help but approve. If this was the center of decision-making in Quel'Thalas, then it was wise of the elves to protect it as much as possible. The magistrix led them into the structure, past the spellbreakers who watched them with stoic expressions. The interior was just as grand as its exterior, with wide and resplendent halls, tapestries, and various other elvish fopperies that Haedix didn't care about. What was far more interesting was the angry elvish woman who began storming toward them the moment they entered. The woman was one of the few of her kind who showed any signs of aging, and it was clear from her manner of dress that she was of high station. Haedix was almost disappointed when Magistrix Evermind merely gestured to the furious elf and a spellbreaker broke away from the delegation to calmly, but forcefully lead her away. "Is everything all right?" asked Krivax, confusion evident in his voice as he watched the strange scene. "Have we done something to offend your people, Magistrix?" A hint of annoyance flashed through Evermind's expression before disappearing. "Not at all, Ambassador. There have simply been some political disagreements within the convocation which Lady Eleonara is very passionate about. It is nothing that you need to be concerned about." Haedix didn't believe a word of that and made a mental note to investigate the grievances of Lady Eleonara at a later time. He could tell that Krivax also shared his suspicions, but there was little they could do. "Understood," Krivax replied diplomatically, keeping any doubt out of his voice. Magistrix Evermind nodded and led them further into the building. The hallway gave way to a grand chamber with an arched ceiling adorned with elvish motifs and a large, circular table in the center surrounded by 7 overly intricate chairs, 6 of which were empty. Sitting at the head of the table was an elven man clad in robes of deep purple who could only be Grand Magister Belovia. His presence commanded immediate attention, the air around him charged with a subtle aura of magic that even most viziers would find imposing. Much like Lady Eleonara, the Grand Magister was one of the few elves that showed signs of age, with bits of grey in his brown hair and slightly weathered skin, though his eyes held an intelligence that made clear he was not to be underestimated. Haedix was not a person who easily impressed, but there was an imperceptible quality about the elf in front of him that put him on edge. If the 6 empty seats of the absent elvish lords weren't already clue enough, Haedix would have quickly realized that Grand Magister Belovia was a very dangerous individual. "Welcome, Ambassador Krivax of Azul Nerub, to Silvermoon City," the Grand Magister greeted, rising from his seat to offer a courteous but distant bow. "I was quite glad to receive your request to visit our city. A meeting like this between our nations was quite overdue. There had been communications between Azul Nerub and Quel'Thalas for quite some time, of course, but this was the highest-ranking diplomatic encounter they'd had so far after the Second War, and the first on their own soil." "Indeed, Grand Magister Belovia," Krivax responded, returning the bow with practiced ease. "It is a pleasure to see you again. We haven't had the chance to speak since our last encounter in Capital City." "Quite. If my recollection is correct, you were quite different at the time," said the Grand Magister, gesturing toward the piles of enchanted cushions near the desk. "Much like the kingdom you serve, you've elevated yourself at a speed that has left many surprised, Ambassador. Forgive me for the inconvenience, but we could not find a seat appropriate for someone of your stature." The next few minutes were dull as Haedix quietly listened to his apprentice and the Grand Magister exchanged the obligatory pleasantries. There was a moment when Belovia attempted to pull Hadix into conversation, offering him compliments about the duel he had in Dalaran against that pitiful elf, but he politely deflected. Hadix's role here was simply as an observer, one who could notice the smaller details that Krivax might not. His apprentice had earned his position as Azrael Nerub's head ambassador, and Hadix would not infringe on it unnecessarily. Fortunately, Belovia seemed like a person who also disliked tedious formalities, and they soon moved on to the topic at hand. The Alliance Defense Force seems like quite an interesting proposal, Ambassador, said Grand Magister Belovia with what sounded like genuine approval. A paramilitary organization made up of powerful individuals and augmented by the diverse resources of the various member nations of the Alliance. One with the mandate to identify and confront threats to the safety of our peoples. An organization like that would certainly be of great use. Thank you, Grand Magister. I think so as well, said Krivax after a moment of hesitation. Then, can Azrael Nerub expect your nation's support once we present this proposal to the Alliance? Hadix didn't blame Krivax for his confusion. It was a sentiment that they shared. Grand Magister Belovia smiled thinly as he responded. You can. In fact, Quel'Thalas approves of this initiative so much that we intend to assist Azrael Nerub in its funding and management. I already have several magisters eager to offer their services. Ah. Now I see. The elves didn't want to block Krivax's proposal. They wished to take it over and make it their own. So long as Azrael Nerub was the only nation funding the Alliance Defense Force, it was only natural that they would be able to have overwhelming control over it. Now that Quel'Thalas had shown an intent to expand their influence beyond their borders, they would naturally seek to control such a potentially powerful organization. Quel'Thalas lacked the influence to do so now, but Hadix had no doubt that the Grand Magister would eventually propose that an elf should lead the Alliance Defense Force. If that was to become the case, then Azrael Nerub would be forced to hand over the fruits of its resources and labor to a rival nation. Your willingness to assist us is very generous, Grand Magister, but it is unnecessary, said Krivax, obviously choosing his words carefully. Azrael Nerub had already allocated sufficient resources to this project. While we appreciate your offer, we would not wish to impose an unnecessary burden on your people. The Grand Magister paused for several moments as he assessed Krivax. After a while, he let out a soft chuckle before speaking. Unfortunately, I'll have to insist. I have a belief that Quel'Thalas is duty-bound to protect and shepherd those who cannot do so themselves. This initiative offers us the perfect opportunity to exercise that duty, and I'd be remiss to not take advantage of it. Once Belovia finished speaking, Hadix suddenly realized what quality about the elf bothered him so much. It was hidden very thoroughly, but he could sense a deep conviction in the old elf's words that reminded him of the zealotry Hadix often encountered in void cultists. It was quite telling that the Grand Magister had used the word shepherd rather than lead when speaking of his people's role. When the Grand Magister spoke, it was with a surety of purpose and a desire for control that Hadix found troubling. He had a feeling that Azrael Nerub and Quel'Thalas would be conflicting much more in the near future. Hadix turned his attention to his apprentice and saw that he seemed quite uncomfortable. It was unlikely that Krivax could discern the Grand Magister's true nature, but the brat generally had good instincts. Hadix suspected that Krivax would start complaining that the elf was creepy as soon as they were able to speak privately. Krivax made an admirable attempt at convincing the Grand Magister away from interfering with the Alliance Defense Force, but it was a hopeless endeavor. Belovia eventually bluntly stated that Quel'Thalas would use its influence to ensure that the initiative would not move forward unless they were allowed to contribute and were granted certain privileges. Faced with such an ultimatum, Krivax had no other choice but to capitulate, though not before receiving a concession that Quel'Thalas would assist in having the proposal ratified by the Alliance as quickly as possible. Hadix knew that Krivax wanted the organization formed in time to confront the Lich King. Splendid, said Grand Magister Belovia, his eyes glinting with a hint of triumph as he leaned forward. With our two nations in agreement, I'm certain the Alliance Defense Force will be officially formed within the next few weeks. I must say, Ambassador Krivax, I'm truly glad that we were able to meet today. I've been keeping quite a keen eye on you recently, so this has been a pleasant opportunity. Really? Said Krivax, distinctly unnerved by the elf. That is flattering, Grand Magister. May I inquire as to the reason? From what I understand, you've risen rapidly in your nation's hierarchy while also being largely responsible for its current diplomatic successes, said Grand Magister Belovia, his gaze assessing as he stared at Krivax. You've received the favor and blessing of one of the most powerful entities on Azeroth, and continue to expand Azrael Nerub's influence across the world. I have found your actions to be quite inspiring. If only you had been born in Quel'Thalas. The Grand Magister trailed off with clear regret. Krivax shifted in discomfort before responding. Thank you, Grand Magister. I am honored by your words and look forward to our future cooperation. If there is nothing else, then I believe we have discussed all necessary matters for the day. Ah, there is just one more thing, said Grand Magister Belovia, standing from his seat. I intend to send my student, Magister Romarth, to represent Quel'Thalas in the Alliance Defense Force. I believe it would be best if he spent some time away from his regular duties, and I believe this is the best opportunity to do so. Haedix remembered that name. Romarth was the mage sent by Quel'Thalas to assist in recovering the dragon soul from Chagall. From what he could recall, Romarth seemed to be very close to Prince Kael'thas and a powerful archmage in his own right. If nothing else, he was far from an unworthy candidate. Most importantly, he would be a perfect source of information to understand the current political situation in Quel'Thalas. Haedix dearly hoped that whatever folly had overcome the elves was manageable. After all, it would be truly troublesome if the struggle for influence between Azrael Nerub and Quel'Thalas continued to escalate.